Right, so Joseph Conroy is with us because we're talking UFC and how they absolutely need the help of boxing to survive, or do they? This is the premise of a brilliant piece written by Brin-Johnathan Butler. Brin-Jonathan, good morning to you.
Good morning to you.
My favourite line from your entire piece was, the great fear here is that they've just bought MySpace.
That was really the germ for me doing the whole piece, was when a friend of mine, an attorney and boxing manager, Kurt Emhoff. Can you not hear me?
Yeah, we can. All good.
Sorry. A friend of mine, an attorney and boxing manager, Kurt Emhoff, made that analogy, and I thought, there is a big piece here because everybody understands exactly what that means.
Yeah. And so they're terrified that they've invested in something at its absolute peak or on its way down.
Absolutely. It's a huge bubble, $4.2 billion that WME spent to acquire this property that's not coming anywhere near the projections that they've tried to offer. So it's fascinating, just the perception of a sport like boxing, that you hear this boxing is dead, which was another germ for this piece, which is, how long have people been saying that? How long has that perception been there? And the answer is 119 years people have been saying that. It's still here. And it's endured a lot of lean times over a century. The question is whether the UFC can endure some lean times as it's struggling with producing some new stars to replace some of the old ones. And I think it's going to really struggle a lot. And, this piece was really just sort of mining a lot of different people in both sports to sort of understand the data, and the data does not look good.
So talk to us a little bit about that, because the sense that boxing is going through a lean time isn't actually true at the moment. Like, we've seen some absolutely amazing proper super fights where the best fighters in their weight division and weight classes are finally meeting each other, and obviously there was the Mayweather-McGregor fight, which we can kind of separate for a moment. Sure. As an outlier, but as a harbinger of everything else that has been going on. There have been some really good figures coming through for boxing on the traditional networks.
That's right. Boxing's on TV, and when it's head-to-head with the UFC, contrary to perception, it's destroying them. It's doing way better numbers, and it's doing better numbers with a younger demographic, which is the key demographic they're looking for. So that really goes against the image that the UFC's tried to perpetrate as this new kid on the block, and it's just destroying boxing because boxing is an old man's game in terms of their audience. So boxing's on ESPN, it's on regular TV, and huge numbers of people are watching, even not big-name fighters, like not just the McGregor versus Mayweather, but when it's on TV, millions of people are watching it. And it's only been there now for a little over a year. So I think that there's a lot of upside if they put on really impressive fights the way it used to be in this country. I mean, if you look back at Muhammad Ali versus Leon Spinks, I think that had something like 80 million Americans were watching that fight. There were only a few channels at that time, but I mean, this was like the moon landing sort of figures that it was getting in terms of an audience. And the UFC, just because it's not producing its stars, it's really killing its idols. It's forcing them to go head-to-head all the time. They have some of the lowest paid athletes in professional sports, which is a major problem. Ronda Rousey, which really transcended the sport. The people who are beating Ronda Rousey are not becoming Ronda Rousey. So it created a role that was sort of a one-off. So there's a big problem there as well. I'm not sure where the future stars are going to come from when they can't make any money. And Conor McGregor, after moving into boxing for that farce that they put on, wants a share of ownership, which would set a terrible precedent for anybody else who sort of emerges as a big star. So I'm not sure what Dana White's going to do. And I did reach out to the UFC and WME for comment, and some of their quotes were pretty laughable in terms of their optimism. It's just not backed up by any of the numbers.
Because ultimately that's a double-edged sword, Brin-Jonathan, as in you almost need the sports stars to transcend their own sport for you to to propel this thing up to the level of boxing. So you have Ronda Rousey, she's ended up leaving the sport. You've got Conor McGregor, he's ended up wanting a slice of this pie, and a big slice at that. But to actually get to boxing's level, you probably need a few more of those stars, but you also need them to kind of stay in line.
Absolutely right. Yeah, you need stars, and usually what we see, at least in boxing, is the stars that really resonate with an audience have to be there for a while. We need them for 5 years, 6 years, and that's just not happening. The shelf life in the UFC is really, really brief. And the other big problem, of course, is that they're all popping for drugs. You've got Brock Lesnar, you've got John Jones, you've got Anderson Silva. Drugs is just a major problem. It's been a free-for-all in the UFC, and there's so many elements of the UFC, even more so than boxing, that are just a complete black box. We don't know how they're running their contracts, which is why Kurt Emhoff featured so prominently in the article, was because he's dealt with these contracts. He's aware of what they are. He obviously can't disclose exactly in specifics what they are, but one of the comments he made to me is, if you compare them to, say, Don King contracts, and we know what Don King used to write a blank piece of paper, push it over to his fighter and say, sign it, and then he'd fill in the rest. That UFC contracts he said, are not as bad as the worst Don King contracts, but they're not far off, which is a standard current contract for UFC fighters. So I'm just wondering if it's trying to professionalize. It has a lot of antitrust lawsuits that it's facing right now. There are just huge problems that are confronting the UFC as it sort of becomes a major sport. And some of the projections that Dana White was making in terms of we're going to be bigger than the NFL, which currently is earning something like $14 or $17 billion, there's nothing to back that up at all. So it sounds nice, and it's nice that some of the people that I interviewed from the UFC are optimistic, but nothing in the data supports it. And so that was sort of what the story was about, was just assembling a collage of sort of all of this data from many different angles. And I wasn't cherry-picking the data. It's pretty straightforward data that you'd want as an investor. So it's just really hard to understand what the WME was looking at in terms of where it's going to go in the UFC in 2, 3, 5, 10 years.
And just in terms of the sport continuing to grow and kicking on and getting Conor back in the octagon, do you think that if they want to get to this NFL level, this kind of next level financially, get this bigger audience, is co-promotion the way they're going to have to go? Will they have to start paying kind of boxing style money to these fighters? Like, is this kind of low purse model, has that just come to an end?
I don't think it's come to an end. It's just a question of whether it's sustainable. So, I mean, they're moving into boxing. They've made overtures to it, and that's definitely where they're going. Al Heyman has a big problem in that he's shut off of TV. He dropped huge amounts of venture capital into trying to bring fighters to television. He did it poorly. He didn't put on fights that people wanted to see. They were buying it in order to be on TV. TV wasn't paying them to have it on. And so Heyman is probably going to bring his stable of fighters to sort of move into some kind of model that him and Dana White are going to create together. I just don't know if it's going to be able to compete with ESPN and some of the good fights that we're seeing on there. You had Rigondeaux and Lomachenko getting a very considerable audience, and it's unusual for small fighters to sort of resonate with an American audience on TV, but it did. And it certainly annihilated the UFC in terms of the numbers that were on the same day, and I think that's happened all 4 times that the boxing has gone head-to-head with the UFC. So I don't know where the UFC can go other than trying to use boxing, as is the title of the piece, as a lifeline at this point.
How would that lifeline actually work? So they would just partner up and use their airtime and use their real estate to get fighters on, or would they be half a fight card and half a UFC card? Like, do we know what that blend will actually look like?
We don't know, and they're cards to their chest in terms of exactly how they want to do it and calibrate that model. We've never seen it work particularly well, so I'm not sure. And Rousey is left; she's not coming back. She's gone to wrestling. A lot of these UFC fighters are moving to wrestling because there's better money in it. It's safer for them. So I'm just not sure exactly how they're going to do it, or if it's something that people are going to watch. One of the great models that the UFC came up with was the reality TV show to show you young fighters on their way up. You'd have older fighters mentoring them. That show's not working very well any longer. Fight Pass is another means that fans have to sort of watch fights. The numbers are not great there also. So they've run into some missteps over the last couple years, and they've sort of offering the projections based on McGregor Mayweather. I don't know if that's something that can be repeated in terms of garnering that kind of audience again, because the result was just abysmal. I mean, it was cartoonish.
And of course, this investigation comes against the backdrop of the UFC most likely finalising a new TV rights deal. How damaging is this lean period going to be in terms of those negotiations? And do you have any feeling for kind of what type of a deal they're looking at?
Yeah, very much so, because what they're looking at is the projections they had were, I think, making in the neighborhood of 700 to 800 million, and they're actually making about a quarter of that. So it's another issue that the sale of WME was sort of predicated on that basis, that they're going to do huge numbers on television, and they just haven't come anywhere close to those projections. So I think there's going to be a reassessment, and just as an image problem, signing a big deal with Fox Sports, because there's nowhere else for them to really go, that number is going to be a lot lower than what they were offering in terms of in the lead up to signing with WME.
And of course, there's kind of other issues happening in the sport as well. We've seen Bellator kind of stealing a bit of a margin, signing some good new talent, stealing some free agents from the UFC. If the UFC kind of continue down this path, and if it's kind of being run as this entertainment company and that model's not really working, they're not getting the blockbuster fights, how in danger do you think the future of the organisation as a whole is?
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question, is how marginalized could it become? As you try to compete with other major sports, it gets harder. I mean, it used to be... one thought I had is sort of like an indie band on its way up. So it has these fans that are incredibly devoted to it, and then once the band reaches the mainstream, a lot of those fans feel alienated, like it's not ours anymore. And I think the UFC is confronting that issue, in that as a mainstream entity, a lot of its business practices now are forced to be more transparent, and it's very resistant to being transparent. And the primary reason is because its model is terrible for the people that are actually participating in it and exposing themselves to so much risk in the sport, which is going back to just the shelf life of these great fighters is so low. And you have to ask, why is it so low? Because they're not protected the way they can be in boxing. There's no way you could create a Floyd Mayweather having a sustainable, undefeated record for such a long period of time, where I'm not saying he didn't fight names, but he was very much able to sort of be his own boss and look after his career and sort of curate what are fights that can make money but are a little bit less dangerous. There's no way you can do that in the UFC. So I think a lot of fighters that might go into it would be hesitant, to operate in the existing model that it has, which is completely good for Dana White, but it's not good for fighters. I mean, these guys are making nothing relative to their success in the sport. I mean, even Rousey was not making any kind of money commensurate with her audience or the kind of publicity she had. I mean, she's one of the most famous people in the world, which is insane. I can't think of another sport where a female transcends not just, bigger than Serena Williams in tennis in terms of just being the face of mixed martial arts. It was incredible, her trajectory. I don't know how that's going to happen again.
Joe, you've obviously been covering UFC for a long time now. The year where this deal ends up getting done is on the back of the 2016 year, where it looks like there are a bunch of fighters, and McGregor is just one of a number of fighters. It turned out he wasn't. And you were saying that, so Nate Diaz is obviously somebody that did have that crossover appeal. Again, partly because he fights McGregor, but absolutely because he wins that first fight. So we haven't seen him back.
There's an interesting point, though. Even kind of by the time you get to Diaz 2, McGregor Diaz 2 happened just days before this deal was finalised and publicly announced. And even to make that fight, the Fertittas had started kind of bending their rules and doing things like they'd put a whole division, the 145 division on hold to make this fight happen, which was kind of the start of this unsustainable model, which I don't know if you have any opinion on this, whether they were starting to kind of poison the well a bit already, starting to kind of do things that didn't make sense for the longevity of the sport, but were delivering these massive numbers and creating this massive star.
No, I mean, when the UFC began, one of the initial suggestions they had about like how to organize it, it seemed like they watched Bloodsport and thought, let's try to recreate this. No, but I mean, it's even worse than what Bloodsport was with the Kumite. Originally, they were going to have a shark tank, like encircling the ring. There was going to be barbed wire. I mean, these guys were outlandishly creative and ballsy in terms of the approach that they had. But you're just seeing eventually not having professionals, but people sort of flying by the seat of their pants. There are problems with that kind of approach once you reach the mainstream, or else boxing has been sustainable as a black box where you have an equal mixture of people with Harvard MBAs who are running it, and a Don King comes out of prison to run it just as well. A lot of his ideas get incorporated by the Harvard MBA people, but there's no oversight, there's no regulation, there's no governing body. That is something which has left boxing, as Jimmy Cannon said, as the red light district of sports. And I think the UFC is a corner in the red light district of sports that people who would otherwise enjoy prostitution would avoid just because it's so dangerous.
And kind of at this juncture, going to a point where we're going to be sort of setting cards for the summer of 2018, how desperate will the UFC be to get Conor back in there, and kind of what type of money, what type of deal do you think could happen?
Well, I think they're desperate to get Conor back in there. I think he's their only big star, and he's the only big star who hasn't been pinched with performance-enhancing drugs. And he definitely transcends the sport, even transcends sports. He's a tremendous character. I watched him while he was doing his promotion in New York. I mean, he's electrifying. I mean, I wasn't encouraged by some of the ways in which he was inciting an audience in Brooklyn when he came with Mayweather, but there's no question that he is a great character. But what he's talking about in terms of taking over some kind of part ownership, that's a precedent that would be, I think, a death knell to the UFC, because anybody who's going to come up is going to want exactly the same thing. And these guys have been very resistant to relieve any control. So Conor has some pretty interesting bargaining chips about coming back, but I thought his shtick all along was almost better suited for wrestling than it was for the UFC. And Rousey now, we're going to see what she's going to do in wrestling, but I mean, it just seems like a logical place for him to go to capitalize on his audience and take a lot less risk and make a lot more money. So I'm not sure what the UFC is going to have to do to bring him in, but giving up partial ownership seems like a non-starter.
Brin-Jonathan, thanks very much for joining us and for staying up for us. Cheers, man.
My pleasure. Take care.
Brin-Jonathan Butler there. You can read that piece on Bloomberg, and we've tweeted it out on the Off the Ball account, or at Off the Ball AM. It doesn't feel like McGregor's coming back, but when you hear about the dearth in the sport of real superstars, and that Diaz won't fight unless he gets the same money, or the type of money he would only really get for fighting McGregor, you realise he does have a bit of power. Yeah,
it still has a knock-on effect on guys like, they've recently had a card fall through where they've tried to get Diaz, and Diaz has been kind of tweeting and kind of flirting with the idea of coming back, but then when push comes to shove in these negotiations, he's saying no to everything that isn't Conor, and also, like, a lot of the reports are he's just kind of chilling out on a yacht and doing triathlons and living the good life. He, like, think of a fighter like him, he wouldn't make peanuts all his career, walking away with whatever amount of millions he made from those two fights. It's hard to get these guys back in the octagon, especially if you're doing this, if you've got this model that is just trying not to pay anyone anything.
Yeah, so the main issue is that everybody's on a contract, and we would have spoken to one of the fighters who was coming towards the end of a contract, and he was talking about his first fight was 12 grand, his second fight would have been 24 grand, his third fight was 36, and at that point he's like in the top 6, top 8 in the world. Like,
even with these contracts, they're actually technically more like freelancers who are kind of contracting themselves out to the UFC, but they're not employed by the UFC, which affects their ability to unionise. When you start going under the surface and start hearing these guys talk, it is like, obviously they love the sport, they just want to do it, and
that's exactly why I think that a massive global corporation thinks, we'll pay $4 billion for this. Look, this is amazing. You're basically exploiting your workers and taking all the money. It's like, it's the perfect model. But after a while, you start to realise that they're risking their lives and there will be long-term damage to them. So they think they want a bit more money.
But they're also paying $4 billion for something which is deemed by some to be the sport. People look at UFC, and a lot of people say, oh, UFC is a sport. It's not a sport. Imagine if you could pay $4 billion to buy boxing. Like, you would absolutely buy that at a drop of a hat. And of course, as we've just outlined, MMA has nowhere near the power of boxing, and it doesn't have the history that it has, and is faltering in big markets compared to boxing. But still, you're essentially you're buying the monopoly of the top athletes in one sport.
Yeah, well, but you're not anymore because Conor McGregor broke the model.
Well, that's the thing.
But also, they had damaged their own model as well. This Reebok deal they've done, which is a massive corporate deal for them, which was part of the idea of it was kind of window shopping. We're working with these kind of blue chip companies prior to the sale, but which took away the main revenue stream for most of these fighters, which was having, if you have Xbox on your shorts, if you've got Budweiser on your shorts, bringing in massive advertising money, you're now told you're not allowed to do that anymore. You can't have these private sponsorship deals.
You did feel like you had some way of controlling your own revenue and your own income, which somehow gave you a sense of, at least, if I fight and win, I'm going to get a massive sponsorship deal. But when they take that away from you, it's like, no, you're getting your 36 grand.
And that's also that option is still being offered by their main competitor, Bellator. So if you go over to Bellator for less money, you can still be running your own kind of business and be in control of it and getting your own sponsors.
Yeah.
I would like to get Brin-Jonathan back on. I'm not sure does he have a deeper knowledge of it, but there's one line that stuck out to me from the Bloomberg piece, which I'm sure we'll tweet out, just about Poland and Brazil and the fact that boxing has never penetrated those markets, but the UFC is huge. Of course, with Brazil, you can list off countless huge stars that they've had that have almost transcended the sport as much as Conor McGregor has. But with Poland, maybe not so much, and you start to think, is there socioeconomic reasons here that there's more of an appeal about UFC, or that when the boxing boom was happening, these countries weren't as developed and weren't able to enjoy the things that the United States had to offer on cable television and stuff like that. So there could be a separate piece in that, but it's something that certainly stuck out to me, that it's still the dominant combat sport in two huge markets.
Yeah, even in Ireland though, what our pay-per-view events in the US are on your basic kind of BT package here, where, so say a massive UFC fight is more accessible to the Irish public than something that's on, say, UK box office boxing fight, where you have to go and add something onto your bill and go to the problem of going and buying it.
Yeah, I mean, there's also like a demographic element to this, in that, like, somebody was saying that the UFC audience are basically white rednecks, and that that was a valuable coterie of people for a large organisation to buy access to that audience on a regular basis.
That's in the United States, I presume.
Yeah, but I mean,
the NRA is a rich organisation.
Like, yeah.
If you can tap into the same market as the NRA, you go for that business model.
Well, I'm not a million miles away from thinking that that's exactly what happened in this instance.
NASCAR makes a lot of money.
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly what it is. It's the NASCAR audience who, at the end of the night want to flick on after a few Bud Lights and watch stuff. And, like, for whatever reason, that's not the case in, I don't know, the audience is in a very interesting audience in Ireland.
They're probably oversimplifying things a little bit.
Obviously, deliberately, but, like, I mean, that was certainly, that was what the boxing fraternity would have said about that audience.
Yeah.
That the protagonists were fairly cookie cutter in terms of the Americans, and the Nate Diaz's of this world are a bit of an outlier. Right. That took